Introduction. Few maritime disasters have gripped human imagination as powerfully as the sinking of the RMS Titanic. On the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912, the largest and most luxurious ocean liner ever built at the time struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank within 3 hours, killing more than 1,500 of the roughly 2,224 people aboard. The tragedy became a symbol of human ambition colliding with the limits of technology and nature, and more than a century later it remains one of the most studied, retold, and mythologized events in modern history. The age of ocean liners. To understand the Titanic, one must understand the era that produced it. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a golden age of transatlantic travel. Steamship companies competed fiercely for passengers, particularly wealthy travelers moving between Europe and North America, as well as the millions of immigrants seeking new lives in the United States. Speed, luxury, and size became matters of national and corporate pride. The Blue Ribbon, an unofficial award for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic, was contested by rival shipping lines, most notably the British Cunard Line and the White Star Line. White Star Line, owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company and led by J. Bruce Ismay, decided in the early 1900s to compete not on speed, but on size and comfort. The company commissioned 3 sister ships, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, to be built by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. These ships were designed to be the largest moving objects ever created by human hands, offering unprecedented luxury alongside practical accommodations for immigrants traveling in third class. Design and construction. Construction of the Titanic began in March 1909 at the Harland and Wolff shipyard. The ship was an engineering marvel for its time. It measured about 882 feet in length, displaced over 46,000 tons, and stood as tall as an 11-story building. It was powered by a combination of reciprocating steam engines and a low-pressure turbine, generating enough power to reach a top speed of around 23 knots. The ship's design included 16 watertight compartments, separated by 15 transverse bulkheads that could be sealed by doors operated remotely from the bridge. This safety feature led to the Titanic being popularly described as unsinkable, a label the press and public embraced enthusiastically, though it was never a term the builders themselves used with certainty. The compartments were designed so that the ship could stay afloat even if up to 4 of the forward compartments were flooded. Tragically, the nature of the iceberg damage would open a much longer wound along the hull, flooding more compartments than the design could safely handle. Titanic's interior reflected the extravagance of the era's elite. First-class passengers enjoyed a grand staircase crowned with a glass dome, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, Turkish baths, opulent dining saloons, and staterooms modeled on the styles of Louis XIV, Louis XVI, and Georgian design. Even the second-class accommodations were considered comparable to first-class quarters on other liners. Third class, while more modest, was notably clean and comfortable compared to steerage conditions on many rival ships, offering communal dining rooms and lounges that attracted many immigrant travelers hoping for a better life in America. The ship was launched on May 31, 1911, before a large crowd in Belfast, and then spent the following months undergoing fitting out, where interiors, engines, and equipment were installed. Sea trials were conducted in early April 1912, and the ship was declared ready for service. The maiden voyage. Titanic departed Southampton, England, on April 10, 1912, under the command of Captain Edward John Smith, a veteran of the White Star Line known for his steady reputation and popularity among wealthy travelers. The ship called at Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland, to pick up additional passengers before setting out across the Atlantic toward New York City. Aboard were approximately 2,224 passengers and crew, drawn from a striking cross-section of society. In first class traveled some of the wealthiest people in the world, including businessman John Jacob Astor IV, department store owner Isidore Straus and his wife Ida, and Denver socialite Margaret Molly Brown, who would later be dubbed the Unsinkable Molly Brown for her actions during the sinking. Second class carried professionals, clergy, and tourists. Third class was filled largely with immigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, seeking opportunity in the United States and Canada. Below decks, hundreds of crew members, including engineers, stokers, stewards, and a ship's orchestra, kept the vessel running. The early days of the voyage were unremarkable, marked by fine weather and the routine business of ocean travel. However, throughout April 14th, Titanic received multiple wireless warnings from other ships about ice fields in the area she was crossing. Some of these warnings were relayed to the bridge, but others were delayed or set aside as wireless operators prioritized transmitting personal messages for passengers, a common practice of the era that historians have since scrutinized. The collision. On the night of April 14, 1912, the sea was unusually calm and the sky clear, conditions that, counterintuitively, made spotting icebergs more difficult, since there was no wave action to create visible white water breaking against the ice. At approximately 11:40 p.m. ship's time, lookout Frederick Fleet, stationed in the Crow's Nest, spotted an iceberg directly ahead and alerted the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the ship turned and the engines reversed, but the maneuver came too late to avoid contact entirely. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the hull below the waterline. The impact did not create one large gash, as often depicted in early accounts, but rather a series of narrow openings and buckled seams across roughly 6 of the 16 watertight compartments. This was the critical vulnerability. The ship's compartmentalization system could handle the flooding of 4 compartments, but not 6. Water began pouring in, and it quickly became apparent to the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who was aboard for the maiden voyage, that the Titanic was doomed. Andrews reportedly informed Captain Smith that the ship had, at most, a couple of hours left afloat. The sinking. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe complicated by inadequate preparation. Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for about 1,178 people, roughly half of those on board, despite the ship having a total capacity of over 2,200. This shortfall was legal under the outdated maritime regulations of the time, which based lifeboat requirements on a ship's tonnage rather than its actual passenger capacity. The regulations had not kept pace with the growth of ship sizes. As the crew began loading lifeboats around 12:30 a.m., confusion reigned. Many passengers did not initially believe the ship was in danger, given its reputation for being unsinkable, and some lifeboats were launched far below capacity. The order of women and children first was followed with varying degrees of strictness across different parts of the ship, and access to lifeboats was, in practice, easier for first-class passengers than for those in third class, partly due to the ship's layout and the slower dissemination of information. The ship's band, led by violinist and bandmaster Wallace Hartley, famously continued playing music on deck as the disaster unfolded, an act of composure that became one of the most enduring images of the tragedy. Wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked frantically to send distress signals, eventually using the newly adopted SOS signal alongside the older CQD distress call, reaching several nearby ships. The closest ship to respond in time was the RMS Carpathia, under Captain Arthur Rostron, which was roughly 58 miles away when it received the distress call. Rostron immediately turned his ship around and raced through the same ice-laden waters, arriving around 4 a.m., after the Titanic had already sunk. Another ship, the SS Californian, was much closer, possibly within visual range, but its wireless operator had gone off duty for the night, and its crew reportedly saw distress rockets fired from Titanic without fully grasping their meaning. This failure to respond became one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster in subsequent inquiries. By around 2 a.m., the forward portion of the ship was underwater, and the stern rose dramatically into the air before the ship broke apart, a detail confirmed only decades later when the wreck was discovered. Titanic fully disappeared beneath the surface at approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. Hundreds of passengers and crew who had not found space on lifeboats plunged into the freezing Atlantic water, where the near-freezing temperatures caused death by hypothermia within minutes for most. Rescue and aftermath. Carpathia arrived at the scene shortly after the sinking and spent hours pulling survivors from lifeboats, ultimately rescuing about 705 people. The survivors were brought to New York City, where the disaster had already become international front-page news, largely due to wireless reports that had reached shore even before Carpathia's arrival. The death toll numbered over 1,500, making it one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Losses were disproportionately borne by third-class passengers and crew, reflecting both the ship's layout and the social inequalities of the era. Of the crew, a majority died, including many engineers who stayed at their posts to keep power running as long as possible, an act credited with allowing the ship's lights and wireless to function until nearly the very end. The disaster triggered formal investigations on both sides of the Atlantic. The United States Senate held an inquiry led by Senator William Alden Smith, while the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry was led by Lord Mersey. Both investigations examined the causes of the disaster, the adequacy of lifeboat provisions, wireless communication failures, and the conduct of the crew and nearby ships, particularly the Californian. The inquiries led to significant reforms in maritime safety. Lasting impact on maritime safety. The Titanic disaster reshaped international maritime regulation. In 1914, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, commonly known as SALAS, was established, mandating that ships carry enough lifeboats for all aboard, conduct regular lifeboat drills, and maintain 24-hour wireless communication watches. SALAS has been revised many times since, but remains the foundational international treaty governing ship safety today. The disaster also led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, an organization still operated by the United States Coast Guard, tasked with monitoring iceberg danger in North Atlantic shipping lanes to prevent similar tragedies. Cultural legacy. The Titanic story has been retold in countless books, documentaries, and films, cementing its place in popular culture far beyond its historical significance as a maritime disaster. It has come to symbolize a range of ideas: the hubris of human technological confidence, the stark class divisions of Edwardian society, acts of individual heroism and sacrifice amid chaos, and the fragility of even humanity's greatest achievements when confronted with the power of nature. Survivors' accounts, court records, and later archaeological findings have allowed historians to reconstruct the disaster in remarkable detail, correcting many early myths while confirming others. The ship's story continues to be studied not only as a singular tragedy, but as a case study in engineering failure, crisis management, class inequality, and the evolution of international law. Conclusion. More than a century after it slipped beneath the waves of the North Atlantic, the Titanic remains a touchstone for reflecting on ambition, class, technology, and mortality. Its sinking was not merely the loss of a ship, but a turning point that reshaped maritime law, safety standards, and public consciousness about the limits of human engineering. The Titanic endures in memory not because it was the deadliest disaster in history, but because of what it revealed about the society that built it and the choices made in its final hours. Choices of courage, negligence, sacrifice, and survival that continue to resonate more than 100 years later.